The train rattled onward, its rhythmic clatter a constant companion in the dimly lit car. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. John stared out the window, the cityscape blurring into streaks of light. The neon signs and streetlights melded into a kaleidoscope of colors, a stark contrast to the monotony of his day. He was heading home from another long day, his mind awash with the usual work anxieties. Deadlines, meetings, and the ever-present pressure to perform weighed heavily on him. He didn't notice the empty seat beside him at first. It was only when the train jolted that he glanced over, seeing the vacant spot. Not until a chill, a prickling on the back of his neck, made him turn his head. The seat was vacant, but the air around it seemed colder, almost tangible in its emptiness. Yet, John felt a presence, an unsettling feeling that he wasn't alone. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge them. He shook his head, attributing it to exhaustion. After all, it had been a long day, and his mind was likely playing tricks on him. The train screeched to a halt at his station, the sudden stop jolting him from his thoughts. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, inviting him to step out into the cool night air. As he disembarked, the feeling intensified, a silent weight settling upon his shoulders. The bustling crowd around him did little to alleviate the sense of unease. John quickened his pace, pushing through the crowds. The usual cacophony of voices and footsteps seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of his heart. He could practically feel icy breath on his neck, a phantom sensation he couldn't shake. Every step he took felt heavier, as if something unseen was dragging him back. Reaching his apartment building, he fumbled for his keys, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The key finally turned in the lock and he slipped inside, closing the door behind him with a sigh of relief. But even within the safety of his home, the unsettling feeling lingered, a reminder that some presences are not so easily left behind. The familiar comfort of his apartment did little to soothe John's unease. The walls that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to close in on him, suffocating and oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent shivers down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone, that something sinister had invaded his personal space. He kept seeing fleeting shadows, dark figures lurking at the edge of his vision. They were always just out of reach, disappearing the moment he tried to focus on them. It was as if they were toying with him, playing a cruel game of hide and seek. The more he tried to ignore them, the more persistent they became, haunting his every step. They vanished when he turned his head, leaving behind a residue of dread. It was an unsettling sensation, like a cold hand brushing against the back of his neck. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his heart racing with every unexpected movement. The city, once vibrant and full of life, now felt like a maze of shadows and whispers. He told himself it was stress, the city playing tricks on his weary mind. Sleep offered no respite. His dreams were filled with the same shadows, now more vivid and menacing. They chased him through endless corridors, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. He would wake up gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Nightmares plagued him, vivid and disturbing. Each night the shadows grew bolder, their forms more distinct. They seemed to be reaching out to him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. He could feel their presence even in the waking world, a constant oppressive weight on his shoulders. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of being watched clinging to him like a shroud. The darkness of his room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows shifting and twisting in the corners of his vision. He would lie there, paralyzed with fear, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. Days turned into a blurry cycle of work and sleepless nights, his anxiety growing with each passing hour. Objects began to move. It started with small things, a book misplaced, a glass left on the counter now on the floor. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the incidents became more frequent and harder to ignore. A book misplaced, a glass left on the counter now on the floor. He would find doors ajar that he was sure he had closed, lights flickering without reason. The sense of unease grew stronger, the shadows more persistent. It was as if they were trying to communicate with him, to draw him into their dark world. Small, insignificant things, easily dismissed as absent-mindedness. But the pattern was undeniable. Each incident left him more rattled, more convinced that something was terribly wrong. He began to question his own sanity, wondering if the stress and lack of sleep were causing him to lose his grip on reality. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, terribly wrong. The shadows were no longer just figments of his imagination. They had become a part of his reality. He felt trapped, unable to escape their relentless pursuit. His once familiar apartment now felt like a prison, each room filled with unseen threats. He was living in a constant state of fear, his once familiar apartment now a prison of his own making. The shadows had taken over his life, leaving him a shell of his former self. He knew he had to find a way to break free, to reclaim his life from the darkness that had consumed it. But the question remained, how? One night, lying awake in bed, John heard it. A whisper, faint and chilling, his name a hushed murmur in the darkness. He sat bolt upright, heart hammering in his chest. The sound didn't come again, but it left an icy hand clutching at his insides. He tried to rationalize it. The city was noisy, full of strange sounds that infiltrated even the quietest corners. But deep down, a chilling certainty took root. He wasn't alone. Something was in his apartment, something unseen but ever present. He started talking to himself, a desperate attempt to fill the oppressive silence. He'd find himself apologizing for no reason, begging the unseen entity to leave him be. His sanity felt like a thread, slowly unraveling at the seams. John became a recluse, avoiding contact with the outside world. He quit his job, claiming illness. His phone calls went unanswered. Food rotted on the counter, untouched. He was a prisoner in his own home, held captive by an unseen terror. The whispers continued, growing bolder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the shadows, from the air itself. He couldn't escape them, couldn't outrun the chilling sensation that something was always right behind him, watching his every move. One night he saw it. A flicker of movement in the hallway mirror, a fleeting glimpse of a dark, indistinct figure. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but that brief encounter solidified his worst fears. He was not imagining things, he wasn't crazy. Something sinister had attached itself to him. Section 5, The Confrontation. John couldn't take it anymore. The oppressive darkness of the forest seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with its eerie silence. He grabbed a kitchen knife, the cold metal a strange comfort in his trembling hand. It was a flimsy shield against the unknown, but it was all he had. His eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent his heart racing. He felt a surge of desperate courage. It was now or never. He had to face whatever was haunting him. He would confront this entity, whatever it was. He couldn't live in fear any longer. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice hoarse and strained. The words echoed through the trees, bouncing back at him like a cruel mockery. "I'm not afraid of you," he yelled, trying to convince himself as much as the unseen presence. His voice wavered, betraying his true feelings. The words echoed in the silence, met with a deafening quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He felt a cold spot form beside him, a sudden drop in temperature that made him shiver. It was as if the very air around him had turned hostile. The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a malevolent wind. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling his mind with dread. He could feel his sanity slipping, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. Was this real or just a figment of his tortured mind? He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. The weight of his fear and despair was almost too much to bear. "Leave me alone," he whispered, his voice breaking. The plea was barely audible, a last-ditch effort to find some semblance of peace. "Please, just leave me alone." His words hung in the air, a desperate cry for mercy in a world that seemed devoid of it. Section 6, The Unveiling. A beat of silence. Then a soft sigh right next to his ear. John's eyes flew open. Standing before him, almost translucent, was a young woman. Her eyes were filled with a profound sadness, her expression mournful. John stared, speechless, the knife clattering to the floor. The woman reached out a hand, her touch ethereal like a cold breeze. He flinched, but didn't pull away. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper that seemed to resonate deep within his soul. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice filled with a melancholic tenderness. "I've been trying to reach you, to warn you." John could only manage a shaky breath. Warn him? About what? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Section 7, A Glimmer of Understanding. "You've been in danger," the woman continued, her voice barely audible. "They're coming for you. They want to take you, just like they took me." She pointed a finger towards John's chest. "But you can stop them. You have the power." John's mind reeled. Who were they? What power was she talking about? He wanted to dismiss her as a hallucination, a figment of his sleep-deprived mind. But there was something in her eyes, a sincerity that resonated with a deep-seated fear within him. He found himself nodding slowly, urging her to continue. "The mark," she whispered, her hand moving to hover over his heart. "They can sense it. It's why they chose you. You have to fight back. You have to protect." Her voice trailed off, her form flickering like a dying flame. Section 8. Acceptance and Terror. "Protect what?" John cried out, reaching for her, but his hand passed right through her. The woman was fading, her form becoming more and more translucent. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of urgency and resignation. "Remember," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The bridge. Midnight." And with that, she vanished, leaving behind only a lingering chill and a profound sense of dread. John stood there alone once more in the silence of his apartment. Terror gripped him, cold and absolute. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't imagining things. There were others, unseen entities, and they were after him. But why? What did they want? And who were they trying to hurt? Section 9. The silent passenger remains. The weight of the woman's warning settled upon him, heavy and suffocating. He was caught in something far bigger than himself, a terrifying reality he never could have imagined. The silent passenger on the train was gone, but she had left him with a chilling truth and an impossible choice. He could ignore the warning, try to piece together his shattered life, and pretend none of it ever happened. Or he could face the unknown, confront the unseen forces that hunted him, and protect whatever it was they so desperately sought. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the window, John made his decision. He would find out the truth, no matter the cost. He had a feeling this was only the beginning.